So you're interested in China's economic rise. Well, a lot of people were scratching their heads back in the 80s, especially when the Soviet Union went under.
Yeah, it was a time of huge upheaval, right? Everyone was talking about shock therapy, this really aggressive push to transition economies to like a free market model.
And the assumption was China would be next. I mean, they
hmm
had a similar command economy, right? So it seems like a sure thing.
Exactly. But then they didn't. They zigged when everyone thought they'd zag. And that's precisely what we're diving into today.
With How China Escaped Shock Therapy, which, I gotta say, the title alone hooked me.
hmm
But what makes this book so special?
Well, what's so cool is Isabella Weber, she's the author, managed to get access to all these documents, like primary sources, that have been basically locked away, hidden during China's reform period.
So it's like getting a peek behind the curtain, right?
Totally, like a fly on the wall during these pivotal moments in history.
Okay, so we've got the inside scoop. But it's not just about, like, old documents, is it?
Yeah.
This connection to ancient Chinese economic thought, that's what blew my mind.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's one of the most fascinating things Weber does, showing how deeply rooted Chinese economic thinking is in their history. It's not just about, like, policies, it's about a whole worldview.
Okay, see, now this is why I love these deep dives. We're about to uncover some ancient secrets here. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's bring our listener up to speed. What exactly was this shock therapy that everyone was so worried about?
Imagine, like, waking up one morning and every price tag is just dot blank. Groceries, gas, rent, everything up for grabs, determined by whatever the market decides. And that's essentially what shock therapy was. This sudden, drastic shift to privatize, slash government spending, and just let prices go wherever.
Okay, yeah, I'm already feeling kind of anxious just picturing that.
Yeah.
Talk
Yeah.
about economic whiplash, right?
Exactly. And the goal was to force this super fast transition to a market economy. But just think about the human cost, All that uncertainty, instability. It's actually really vividly illustrated in the book with figures showing like plummeting GDP in some countries that tried this, real incomes basically vanishing, hyperinflation. It was rough.
No wonder everyone thought China would go down the same road. I mean, they were coming from a similar starting point, right?
Right, they were. Similar system to the Soviets, but, and this is where it gets really interesting, they took a hard path on the shock therapy solution.
Okay, now you've got me on the edge of my seat. What did they do? You were saying something about ancient Chinese economic thought. Now, that's not something you hear every day. Like, how does that even play into things?
Well, it all goes back to this text called the Guanzi. It's this collection of writings from like way back in the 7th century BC, covers philosophy, government, and even economics.
7th century BC. Wow, that's, let me think, older than ancient Rome.
Right,
Okay.
way older. And what's wild is it's not just like vague ideas about economics. It gets into some really specific stuff, and it's stuff that feels shockingly relevant even today.
Okay, now I got to know more. Give me an example. What kind of like aha moment are we talking about here?
So there's this whole concept in the Guanzi about price manipulation. They called it regulating the flow. Basically, the idea that whoever controls the supply of essential goods, they can create artificial scarcity, manipulate the market for their own gain.
Wait a minute. So they were already dealing with the problems of like monopolies and price gouging way back then.
Oh, yeah. They totally understood that market forces could be influenced by, well, powerful people. And get this, they even had solutions. One of their big strategies was a system called the ever-normal granaries. Imagine, like, a nationwide system of government storehouses, right? They'd buy up grain when harvests were good and then sell it off when supplies got low.
So it's like a government-run buffer to protect against those like price swings. It's amazing though. That's basically what central banks do today with inflation and stuff. But they were doing it, what, centuries ago?
It just shows you they had this really sophisticated grasp of how to balance market forces with, well, strategic intervention.
Yeah.
Which, as we'll see, becomes a big part of China's approach later on.
Okay, so we've got ancient ideas about markets, the need for some kind of regulation. But how does all of that actually translate to 20th century China when they're facing their own economic challenges? What happened?
So right after the revolution, China's trying to rebuild, right?
Yeah.
And they're dealing with this insane hyperinflation. One of the things they tried at first was price controls, similar to what the U.S. did during World War II, actually.
To like stabilize things.
Yeah, the idea was to get a grip on the economy by fixing prices. But, and this is key, there was a big difference between the U.S. and China at the time.
Oh, I'm curious. What was the difference?
Well, the U.S. was already a heavily industrialized country, right? They could ramp up production to meet demand, no problem. China, on the other hand, they were still mostly agricultural. Their industrial base was, well, way less developed.
So the same strategy that might work in a place that's already got factories and resources coming out their ears, it wouldn't necessarily translate to China's situation.
Exactly. And that's where you get figures like Muqiao stepping in. He was this really influential economist, and he understood that China couldn't just copy-paste some Western economic model.
They needed their own way.
They needed something tailored for them. Muqiao, he was all about learning from, yes, Western economic theory, but also from China's unique history and context.
So not like rejecting Western ideas completely, more like remixing them.
Yeah, exactly. He was all about pragmatism. He knew that a sudden shift to a totally free market, it would be a disaster for China, at least at that time. Socially, economically, it just wouldn't have worked. He pushed for gradual change, carefully thought out to try to minimize disruption as much as possible.
And that takes us to the whole dual track system, which I have to admit I'm still a little fuzzy on how that actually worked in practice.
Okay, so picture it like this. You've got the existing planned economy system, right? The dual track system was designed to be like a bridge between that and a market-driven system.
A bridge? Okay, I kind of see where you're going with this.
So certain things, essential goods and services, things that everyone needs like grain, fuel, that sort of thing, those stayed under the old system. Fixed prices set by the government. That way, people could still afford the basics no matter what.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So how did they bring in the market part of this two-track thing?
So you've got that track where the government's still controlling prices for those essentials, but then there's this whole other track running alongside it, and that's where the market comes in.
Okay, so like two separate systems operating at the same time.
Exactly. On this other track, any goods that weren't considered, absolutely essential, those were allowed to fluctuate based on supply and demand, just like in a regular market.
So what, like farmers could sell their extra produce at whatever price they could get?
That's the idea. Let's say a farmer produces their quota of grain that the government requires, right? Anything they grow on top of that, they can sell on the open market at market prices.
Clever. That way you're incentivizing people to produce more because they can actually make a profit, but you're not leaving everyone else high and dry.
You got it. And it led to some really interesting outcomes. In agriculture, for example, because farmers were responding to these market signals, they actually ended up producing a surplus of grain.
Oh, okay. So now you've got too much grain. That's a recipe for disaster in a free market, isn't it?
Yeah.
Prices would go through the floor.
It could have been a huge problem. But remember those ever-normal granaries we talked about earlier? That ancient system? Well, guess what?
They brought it back.
They sure did. Just like those emperors centuries before, the government stepped in and bought up all that excess grain, and they did it to stop prices from completely bottoming out.
Wow. So they're using this ancient system to manage a 20th century market economy. That's wild.
It's a great example of how they were drawing on their history to navigate these uncharted waters.
It sounds like a really delicate balancing act, though.
It was, and it caused a lot of debate, even within China. By the mid-'80s, you had a lot of economists saying, okay, this dual track thing, it's clever, but it's not sustainable long term.
So what? They were worried it was going to fall apart.
Well, it was creating all these distortions in the market, and it was also creating opportunities for, let's say, some people to game the system. And the book names some names, too, which is really interesting.
Oh, like, ooh, give us the gossip.
So there were economists like Chen Yizi and Wang Xiaoquang. They were urging caution. They'd seen what happened in other countries that tried to transition too quickly. They were all about that slow and steady approach. But then you had others like Wu Jinglian who were getting impatient. They wanted to see faster change, argued the dual track system had got to go.
Wow, so the pressure's really building now.
Yeah.
What happened next? Did they ditch the two-track system?
Well, in 1988, they decided to try a bolder approach, a more aggressive push towards, letting the market set prices. And, well, it didn't go as planned.
What happened?
Inflation, which they thought they were managing, suddenly exploded. People started panicking, buying up everything they could get their hands on, hoarding. And that, of course, just made the inflation even worse. Figure 8.1 in the book, it shows this huge spike. It's crazy.
That's never a good sign.
No, it wasn't. And it wasn't just an economic crisis. All of this, it fed into that wave of social unrest that culminated in, Tiananmen Square.
Right, 1989.
Right.
It's like their attempt to avoid the shock therapy that brought down the Soviet Union might have actually contributed to instability in the long run.
It's a complicated story, but it really underscores how unpredictable these big economic transitions can be.
It makes you think, what are the big takeaways here? I mean, China's journey, it's this whole saga from ancient ideas to these experiments with the dual track system.
I think if there's one thing our listeners should take away, it's that there's no magic formula for economic development. China's story, it really challenges a lot of
You
assumptions.
really did it their own way.
They did.
Okay.
And it paid off, but it wasn't always pretty, was it? They had their share of setbacks along the way. And that actually brings up a whole other question we could spend hours on. What does China's model, this kind of managed capitalism, what does it mean for the future, for China, for the world? I don't know. It's fascinating to think about.
Right. Big questions, no easy answers.
Mm.
Well, for our listener, if you want to dive into all the details of this incredible story, I highly recommend checking out How China Escaped Shock Therapy. It's a wild ride. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.